Welcome back to the tutorial series on Catatumbo framework. My name is Sai Pulla Bhutla. I am the author of Catatumbo. In the last session, we have discussed about entity groups or ancestor keys. We did some sample code to create a child entity um, and set another entity as its parent to demonstrate the how you could use parent-child relationship within the Google's Cloud Datastore, and we covered the two annotations, key and parent key, that help us do or help us form the hierarchy. In this session, I'm going to cover about embedded objects. Um, Embedded objects are basically another complex object that you could embed in your entity. So I'm going to show you the two storage techniques for storing embedded objects, and I'm going to cover the annotations embeddable, embedded, exploded, imploded, and then finally I'll show you how to override properties. With that, let's go to our code. We are going to use this employee again. Um, so let's say we have, so far in the employee, we have very basic data types like string, um, pretty much string, I guess, in this particular example. Now, what if I want to store a much complex object? Let's say, for example, I have an address object and I want to store the address of the employee. So let's go ahead and create an address. Let's have a couple of fields here. Okay, let's say we have, this is our address class and we want to use it as a common class in various entities. For example, to store address of a user, address of an employee, address of a customer, and so on. So let's go ahead and again create our getters and setters for each of the fields and create a toString also. Okay, now let's say we want to use this as a field in our employee class. So I'm going to just add and I'm going to say that's his work address of the employee. And then I'm going to regenerate the toString after I create the getter and setters. All right. So now we have our employee with a work address added. So let's go back to our app class and try to insert a new employee now. Um, of course, we set some of the fields here, and now let's also set the address of the employee. So first, let's create a new address object. All right, so now let's set that address on the employee object. So emp.set work address. And we're calling our insert method. Let's see what happens when we run this. Okay, looks like we got an exception here, and exception is basically saying there is no mapper found to map the address object. So basically there is no suitable mapper found. So in order to make this work, you have to use certain annotations. Um, First of all, in the employee class, we on the work address field, we have to indicate that this is an embedded object, and that's done with the annotation embedded. Now, once you do that, um, if you run this again, it will still fail. Let's go ahead and see what happens now. So right now we're getting an error saying address class must have an embeddable annotation. So just because you said, yeah, I want to embed this object, the framework does not allow persistence unless this class also has the embeddable annotation. So basically, as the author of, whoever is the author of address has to say that this class can be embedded into other entities. So let's go ahead and say this is an embeddable. Now, once you do that, everything should just flow through, and we should be able to persist the employee object. So let's go ahead and run the app. There you go. So we sent in an employee with that work address, with 1 Main Street, New York City. And we also got our inserted employee. Let's go ahead and check our data. So now this is our old entity, this is our brand new entity. So if you notice, we have a new field called city, we have a state, we have street, we have zip. So we have 4 additional fields that came from our embedded address object. Let's go ahead and delete this old one now, just so we have a cleaner and consistent data. Okay, so pretty simple. Pretty much all you have to do is mark the class as embeddable and mark the field in the entity as embedded. And then the framework takes care of breaking apart your embedded object into uh, preliminary fields or basic fields, and then stores them as individual fields. So there are a couple more annotations here, exploded and imploded. Let's see what the difference is. As you probably have noticed, right now uh, our address object is stored in exploded format. Basically, what I mean by exploded is each field of the address became an independent field within the entity. Now, Google Cloud Datastore also supports um, another way of storing complex objects, which is basically the whole object is stored in a single field. So uh, basically, that field will store data in a JSON-like format. In order to do that, you could use the imploded annotation. So we are still saying it's embedded, and we're saying we want to use a storage strategy of imploded. So let's try that and see what happens. So I'm just going to leave this record so we can compare. So let's go ahead and run the app again. Let's refresh. Now notice our new entity got a work address field, and that's basically it contains all the information about the address. So you have a choice between how you want to store your data. Either you can store them in exploded format, which is the default. If you don't specify anything on the embedded, it defaults to exploded. If you specify, if you also add the imploded annotation, it becomes, um, it is stored as a single field. Now, of course, you can also change this and explicitly say exploded, which will still be the same as not having any annotation. So if we run this again, we should see a third record which has the fields exploded into individual fields again. So we now have two fields that have exploded form. All right, so that's about imploded and exploded. Now let's see what are these property overrides and property override for. So for that, let's go back and add another address field called home address. And this is also going to be embedded, and this is also going to be an exploded format, let's say. Now let's go back here and create, let's call this work address, and then we'll create a home address also. All right, well, we just changed the street name to a different street, and let's go ahead and set that home address. Oh, we need to add a getter and setter. Okay, let's go back to the app now and set the home address to home address. And let's go ahead and try to insert this now. Okay, we got an exception here. And the exception says duplicate property zip in employee. And it says check fields home address.zip and work address.zip. So basically, there is a field name conflict because we have two addresses embedded into our employee object, and both are using the zip name, so we don't know how to store. Uh, if we just use the zip as the field for both, then one property is going to overwrite the other, which basically you're going to lose data. That's where these property overrides come into picture. You can specify uh, the property overrides at the entity level. So let's try property overrides. That's basically the value is an array of property override annotation. So now within the property override, you have a name, and you can specify a brand new property annotation. So the name of the property whose mapping is to be overridden. So which property do you want to override? In this case, I'm going to say work address dot zip. And then how do you want to override it? So that would be another property annotation that we are familiar with. Oh. Now you have you can obviously specify a brand new name, and you can also override whether the field should be indexed or not. So the author of the embeddable class might have said, yes, index this or don't index this, but now you can override his decision here if you want to index or not index. So for now, I'm going to just say indexed is false. For this, well, we want zip to be indexed, so let's just leave it there. But let's just say name is work address underscore zip. So in this example, we're saying I want to override work address dot zip. Now these names are basically based on the name you gave here. So that's the name work address is coming from. So basically you have to provide a qualified name of your field, and then work address, and then this zip corresponds to the field definition in the address. So if this were to be postal code, you would specify postal code in the property override annotation. And then we're saying we want to override it with a property called work address underscore zip. So now you can define as many overrides as you want. So if we run this, we should still get an error, but now notice that the complaint is on the city field instead of the zip field. So let's go ahead and override the other three fields. Now, since we have two address fields and we overrode one of them, there should not be any conflict, so we should be able to insert. Let's go ahead and try that. Okay, so everything worked. Let's go back to our console and refresh. Now we have, as you can see, we have new fields with WA underscore for our work address, work state, um, and these are the values for that. And then the home address is still using the default names. However, you can override them as well. So let's go ahead and delete these. Now you can copy paste this whole set for home address also. So let's go ahead and run this now. So now we have the home address fields, 4 of them, and then work address fields, 4 of them. Now embedding is not limited to a single level either. You could, for example, have another embeddable or another embedded object in the address. For example, if you have a postal code object with a couple of fields, one for storing the 5 digits of the zip code and then another field for the 4 digits of the zip code, you can embed that postal code into the address, and the framework happily persists those with no issues. As far as the property overrides go, you typically need to do that if there is a conflict between the property names. For example, in this case where we have two addresses embedded, or you want to override the indexing behavior for any of the fields. So you could turn off indexing on the street name field if you think that's not very useful in your entity. Uh, Other entities you might want to keep it on, so it's entirely up to you. I just want to run one more time with Imploded and see what happens now. So I want to set that also, both of them to Imploded. And let's go ahead and delete this record just so we have clean data. Okay, now with there is just one home address and one work address. If you look at them, home address is still honoring your property overrides. So what your HA underscore CD, if you don't now when you're storing them as in imploded storage format, you typically don't have to override property names because uh, you can't possibly cause a conflict because the field names are distinct in your entity anyway, and that's what is going to be stored as. However, you still need to override the properties to if you want to change the indexing behavior. In other words, yes, you can um, index or unindex the individual fields within the. So let's go and edit this and let me show you what it looks like. So right now all our string values and all are being indexed. We can turn off indexing. uh, Let me quickly show you an example. So let's say I don't want to have an index for the home street. So we say indexed is false, and then we will also turn off indexing for work street. Now let's go ahead and delete this entity and then rerun our example. All right, let's take a look now what that embedded object looks like. So let's go to the home address. Now notice the street has exclude from indexes true. So your home address street is not indexed, but zip, state, and are indexed. Same with the work address. If you edit that, you should see the same thing here also. There it is. Street is not indexed, but all other fields are indexed. That's about how embeddables within the catatumbo framework. It really makes your the mapping of your entities very easy. With that, I would like to conclude this session. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next session.